Marcus Thompson pulled his sedan into the driveway of his newly purchased home on Willowbrook Lane, the engine ticking as it cooled in the warm afternoon sun. He stepped out, stretching his back after the long drive from headquarters, and smiled at the neat rows of houses lining the quiet suburban street. After 23 years of moving from one assignment to another, he finally had a place to call his own. A place where his daughter could visit without staying in hotels. A place with a yard, a porch, and neighbors who waved hello. He was reaching into the back seat for his briefcase when he heard the sound of tires on asphalt. A white SUV with a magnetic sign reading Willowbrook Security Patrol rolled to a stop directly behind his car. Blocking him in, two men emerged wearing matching navy blue uniforms with gold badges pinned to their chests. The uniforms looked official enough at first glance, but Marcus had spent 2 decades in federal law enforcement. He could spot the difference between real authority and costume store swagger. The first man was tall and broad-shouldered, maybe 45, with a military-style haircut going gray at the temples. His nameplate read Chief R. Davison. The second was younger, late 20s, with a thin mustache and the kind of eager energy that often got people into trouble. His tag said Officer Fletcher. Davison hooked his thumbs into his belt and approached with deliberate slowness, his boots clicking against the concrete. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone used to being obeyed. "Without question, you need to move this vehicle. This is a private street. Residents only." Marcus glanced at the house behind him, at the keys still in his hand, and then back at the two men. "I am a resident," he said evenly. "Just closed on this house last week. Moved in yesterday." Davison's eyes narrowed. He looked past Marcus at the house, a well-maintained colonial with blue shutters and a 2-car garage, then back at Marcus. With undisguised skepticism, "This is the Hendersons' place." "Was the Hendersons' place," Marcus corrected, keeping his voice calm and measured. "They relocated to Arizona. I purchased it through Morrison Realty. I have all the documentation. Inside if you need to see it." Fletcher stepped forward, one hand resting on the pepper spray canister clipped to his belt. "Sir, we've had reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood. Several break-ins over the past month. You matched the description of a suspect scene, casing properties." Marcus felt the familiar weight settling into his chest. The weight of being black in spaces where his presence was considered inherently suspicious. The weight of having to prove he belonged again and again in places he had every legal right to be. He had felt it as a young agent in the bureau. He had felt it in courtrooms in federal buildings. And now he felt it in the driveway of his own home. "I'm not casing anything," Marcus said, his patience beginning to fray at the edges. "I live here. This is my house. My name is on the deed." Davison crossed his arms. "Then you won't mind showing us some identification." Marcus considered. Refusing on principle? He was standing in his own driveway, holding his own keys in front of his own house. But he also knew that escalating this situation would only make it worse. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, moving with the deliberate care of someone who understood that sudden movements could be misinterpreted, and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license. Davison examined it with exaggerated thoroughness, tilting it in the light as though checking for forgeries. "Marcus Thompson," he read aloud. "Says here your address is in Fairfax." "That was my previous address," Marcus explained. "I haven't updated the license yet. I just moved in 2 days ago." "Convenient," Fletcher muttered, loud enough to be heard. Woman walking a small white dog slowed her pace on the sidewalk across the street, watching the scene unfold with undisguised curiosity. An older man watering his lawn 2 houses down turned off his hose and stood observing. Marcus could feel the neighborhood's attention settling on him like a spotlight. Davison handed the license back with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Here's the situation, Mr. Thompson. This is a homeowners association community. We have rules here, standards. We don't just let anyone set up residence without proper clearance from the HOA board." Did you attend the mandatory new resident orientation? I wasn't aware there was one, Marcus said. The sellers didn't mention it, and neither did my realtor. Ignorance of community regulations isn't an excuse, Davison said. He pulled a small notepad from his pocket and began writing. I'm citing you for non-compliance with HOA protocols. You'll need to appear before the community board next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Until then, I'm going to need you to park your vehicle in the garage, not the driveway. Visible vehicles must be registered with the HOA and display a valid parking permit. Marcus stared at him. You're writing me a ticket for parking in my own driveway? I'm enforcing community standards, Davison corrected. This neighborhood has a reputation to maintain, property values to protect. We've worked hard to keep this area safe and desirable. We can't have people just showing up and doing whatever they want. Fletcher nodded in agreement, his hand still resting near his pepper spray. You should be thanking us, really. The security we provide is why this neighborhood is worth what it is. I'm not questioning your security, Marcus said carefully, trying to keep his tone neutral despite the anger building in his chest. I am questioning why I'm being harassed in my own driveway when I've broken no laws. Harassed. Davison's voice rose slightly, taking on an edge of indignation. We're doing our jobs. If you have a problem with how we operate, you can take it up with the HOA board. But right now, you need to comply with my instructions or I'll have to escalate this situation. The woman with the dog had stopped walking entirely now. She stood on the corner with her phone out, though Marcus couldn't tell if she was filming or simply texting someone about the confrontation. The man who had been watering his lawn was now walking toward them, curiosity overcoming caution. Escalate how, exactly? Marcus asked, What authority do you have to escalate anything? Davison tapped the badge on his chest. I'm the chief of security for this HOA. I have the authority to detain individuals who pose a threat to community safety and to contact local law enforcement if necessary. So I suggest you cooperate before this gets out of hand. Marcus felt something shift inside him. A line had been crossed. These men, with their fake badges and inflated sense of authority, were threatening to call actual police on him for the crime of existing in his own driveway all black. He had seen this pattern before. He had investigated cases built on exactly this kind of escalation. Petty authorities drunk on small-time power, pushing and pushing until something broke. But what they didn't know was who they were pushing. What they didn't know was that Marcus Thompson was not simply a new resident trying to settle into a quiet neighborhood. He was a 23-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was the assistant special agent in charge of the Washington Field Office's Civil Rights Task Force. He was the man who had spent the last 8 years investigating cases of exactly this kind of abuse, police misconduct, color of law violations, false arrest, intimidation under the pretense of authority. And these two men, with their mail-order uniforms and delusions of power, had just made the worst mistake of their lives. But Marcus said none of this. Not yet. Instead, he took a slow breath and nodded once. I'll move the car, he said quietly. Davison smiled, clearly interpreting Marcus's compliance as submission. Smart choice. And get that HOA registration taken care of. We'll be keeping an eye on you. They walked back to their SUV with the casual confidence of men who believed they had won. Fletcher even had the audacity to offer Marcus a mock salute before climbing into the passenger seat. The SUV pulled away slowly, Davison's eyes visible in the side mirror. Still watching Marcus as they drove off, the woman with the dog hurried away. The man from down the street returned to his lawn, shaking his head. And Marcus Thompson stood in his driveway, keys in hand, and smiled, because they had no idea what was coming. Marcus moved his car into the garage and walked into his new home, setting his briefcase on the kitchen counter alongside the unpacked boxes still waiting for attention. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. He stood there for a moment, hands flat on the granite countertop, processing what had just happened. 23 years in the Bureau. 8 years running. one of the most critical civil rights task forces in the country. He had taken down corrupt police departments. He had dismantled criminal organizations. He had testified before Congress on law enforcement reform. And now he was being written fake citations by HOA security guards who thought a badge from a uniform supply store gave them the authority to police his existence. He pulled out his phone and made a call. It was answered on the second ring. Agent Chen came the crisp voice on the other end. "Sarah, it's Marcus. I need you to run some background checks for me. Personal matter, but it might turn into something more. Go ahead, boss." Robert Davison, probably mid-40s, chief of security for Willowbrook HOA, and Michael Fletcher, late 20s, works under him. "I want to know if either of them has any actual law enforcement background, any complaints filed against them, any previous incidents. Also, pull the incorporation records for whatever company they're working under. Willowbrook Security Patrol." There was a pause. "You okay, Marcus?" "I'm fine. Just ran into a situation I want to understand better before it happens again. I'll have something for you by tomorrow morning. Thanks, Sarah." He ended the call and looked around his kitchen. This was supposed to be a sanctuary, the place where he could finally breathe after decades of confronting the worst impulses of human nature. Instead, it had taken less than 48 hours for those same impulses to find him here. But what Davison and Fletcher didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that they hadn't just harassed a random black man trying to enjoy his new home. They had harassed the one person in this entire metropolitan area who had the knowledge, the resources, and the authority to hold them accountable in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. Marcus had built his career on cases like this. He knew every federal statute that applied. He knew exactly how far private security could go before they crossed into criminal territory. He knew the difference between HO enforcement and unlawful detention, between community standards and civil rights violations. And from what he had just witnessed, Davison and Fletcher had come very close to several lines they shouldn't cross. If only they knew who they were dealing with. Marcus thought they would have driven past his house and never looked back. The next morning, Marcus was sipping coffee on his back patio when his phone buzzed with an email from Agent Chun. The report was thorough. As he knew it would be Robert Davison, no law enforcement background. Previously worked as a private security consultant for various retail chains. No police academy training. No certification beyond a basic security guard license. Had applied to 3 different police departments in his 20s and been rejected by all 3. Founded Willowbrook Security Patrol 2 years ago as a private contractor for the HOA. Company was registered as a standard LLC, not licensed as a proper security firm in the state. No legal authority to detain, arrest, or issue citations with any legal weight. Michael Fletcher. Even less qualified. Previously worked as a loss prevention associate at a department store. No formal training. No law enforcement background. Hired by Davison 8 months ago. One complaint filed against him 6 months ago by a resident who claimed Fletcher had followed them aggressively and demanded identification without cause. Complaint was dismissed by the HOA board without investigation. Marcus, read through the report twice, committing the details to memory. These men were playing dress up with serious consequences. They had no authority beyond what the HOA board had given them, which was essentially permission to patrol the neighborhood and report violations. But they were acting like sworn officers, making threats, and creating an environment of intimidation. He was about to put the phone down when it rang. The caller ID showed a number with a 202 area code. Washington, D.C. He answered immediately. "Thompson." "Marcus, it's Director Hawthorne. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." Marcus sat up straighter instinctively, even though his boss couldn't see him. Director Ellen Hawthorne ran the entire Civil Rights Division for the FBI's Washington field office. She was Marcus's direct superior and one of the sharpest legal minds he had ever worked with. "Not at all, Director. What can I do for you?" I'm calling about the Patterson case. The DOJ wants to move forward with prosecution, but they need you to testify at the grand jury next month. I know you just got settled into your new place, but this one is critical. We're talking about systemic abuse by an entire police department. Your testimony is what holds it together. Marcus rubbed his temple. The Patterson case had consumed the last 18 months of his life. A small-town police force in Virginia that had been targeting black residents with pretextual stops, false arrests, and evidence planting. Marcus's task force had built an airtight case with wiretaps, body camera footage, and testimony from over 40 victims. It was exactly the kind of case that changed policy and ended careers. Of course, Director, whatever you need. Just send me the dates. I knew I could count on you, Marcus. How's the new house, by the way? Everything settling in, okay? Marcus paused, considering whether to mention yesterday's incident. He decided against it for now. It was too early, too uncertain. It's good. Quiet neighborhood. Still unpacking. Well, enjoy it while you can. I have a feeling once the Patterson trial starts, you're going to be spending more time in courtrooms than in that new home of yours. They talked logistics for a few more minutes before ending the call. Marcus set the phone down and looked out. At his backyard, at the fence line that separated his property from his neighbors, at the trees swaying in the light breeze. He thought about Director Hawthorne's words: systemic abuse, pretextual stops, false arrests, and he thought about Davison and Fletcher with their fake badges and real threats. If only they knew. 3 days passed quietly. Marcus unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and tried to settle into the rhythm of suburban life. He went for morning runs through the neighborhood, nodding politely at the few neighbors who acknowledged him and ignoring the suspicious stares from others. He worked remotely from his home office, reviewing case files and coordinating with his team at the field office. On Thursday afternoon, he was in his garage organizing tools when the white SUV appeared again. This time, Davison wasn't alone. Fletcher was with him, along with a third man Marcus hadn't seen before. This one was older, maybe 60, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt with Willowbrook HOA board president embroidered on the chest. Marcus stepped out of the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The older man extended, his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Gerald Whitmore, president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. I understand there was some confusion earlier this week. I wanted to stop by personally to welcome you to the neighborhood and make sure we're all on the same page regarding community standards." Marcus shook his hand out of reflex, noting the firm grip and the practiced ease of Whitmore's delivery. This was a man used to getting his way through politeness rather than force. "I appreciate that, Mr. Whitmore. Though I'm not sure what confusion you're referring to. I purchased this home legally, moved in, and haven't violated any laws." Whitmore's smile tightened. Of course. No one is suggesting otherwise. But you must understand, Mr. Thompson, that this is a carefully managed community. We have procedures in place for new residents, background checks, financial verification, a probationary period where the board reviews the suitability of new homeowners before granting full membership privileges. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "I wasn't aware that purchasing a home came with a probationary period." "It's in the HOA bylaws," Whitmore said smoothly, "which the Hendersons should have disclosed to you during the sale. It's unfortunate that they didn't, but that doesn't exempt you from compliance. Now, I'm not saying you'll have any problems. I'm sure everything will be fine. But we do need you to submit to the standard vetting process. Background check authorization, financial statements, employment verification, 3 personal references. Just standard procedure to ensure that all residents meet our community standards." Behind Whitmore, Davison stood with his arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. Fletcher was taking notes in a small pad, as though documenting the conversation. "For some official record, and if I decline to participate in this vetting process?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice level. Whitmore's smile faded entirely. "Then we'll have no choice but to pursue legal remedies." The HOA has the authority to place liens on properties whose owners refuse to comply with community regulations. We can also restrict your access to common areas, revoke parking privileges, and ultimately initiate foreclosure proceedings for persistent noncompliance. Marcus stared at him. You're threatening to foreclose on my home because I won't submit to an invasive background check that has no legal basis? It's not a threat, Mr. Thompson. It's simply how things work here. We've maintained this neighborhood's reputation for over 20 years by holding everyone to the same high standards. I'm sure you can understand the importance of that. We have families here, children. We need to know who we're living next to. The subtext was impossible to miss. Marcus had heard versions of this speech before in interrogation rooms and depositions. The polite language wrapped around ugly assumptions. The coded references safety and standards that really meant we don't want your kind here. I'll need to review the HOA bylaws before I agree to anything, Marcus said carefully. And I'll probably consult with an attorney to make sure my rights are being respected. Whitmore's expression hardened. That's your prerogative, of course. But I should warn you that legal action will be expensive and time-consuming. It would be much simpler to just cooperate, fill out the forms. Let Chief Davison here conduct a routine security assessment of your property. Answer a few questions. Then we can all move forward as good neighbors. A security assessment of my property? Davison stepped forward. Standard protocol for new residents. I walk through the home, check for any security vulnerabilities, fire hazards, code violations. It's for everyone's safety, including yours. Marcus looked at the three men standing in his driveway at their expressions of entitled authority and felt a cold clarity settle over him. They weren't going to stop. This wasn't about HOA bylaws or community standards. This was about power and control, about putting him in his place, about making sure he understood that his deed and his mortgage and his legal ownership meant nothing compared to their sense of who belonged here and who didn't. What they didn't know was that Marcus Thompson had spent 8 years dismantling organizations built on exactly this kind of abuse. He had taken depositions from police chiefs and city councilors and district attorneys who thought their positions made them untouchable. He had seized records and secured warrants and built federal cases brick by brick until the walls came down on people who had operated with impunity for decades. And these three men, with their HOA bylaws and their fake security patrols, were about to learn what happens when you abuse what little authority you have against someone who actually understands how power works. But Marcus didn't say any of that. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, "I'll think about it." Whitmore's smile returned cold and satisfied. "You do that, Mr. Thompson, but don't think too long. The board meets next Tuesday. If we don't have your compliance documents by then, we'll have no choice but to move forward with enforcement actions. Chief Davison will be in touch." They walked back to the SUV, their body language radiating victory. Fletcher even glanced back over his shoulder with a smirk, as though to say, "We run this place. And you better remember it." Marcus watched them drive away. Then he walked back into his house, pulled out his phone, and made another call. "Agent Chun, it's Marcus. I need you to expand that investigation. I want everything you can find on Gerald Whitmore and the Willowbrook HOA board. Financial records, meeting minutes, any complaints filed with the county, any lawsuits. Also check if there have been any federal fair housing complaints. This HOA in the past 5 years, and pull the records on every property transfer in this neighborhood for the last 3 years. I want to see if there's a pattern. Boss, this sounds like more than a personal matter." Marcus looked out his front window at the quiet street, at the neat houses and manicured lawns, at the facade of suburban perfection hiding something rotten underneath. "It is," he said. "It's about to become very much more than that." The weekend passed with increasing tension. Marcus continued his routines, determined not to let these men dictate how he lived in his own home. But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And he was right. On Saturday morning, he noticed the white SUV parked at the end of the street. Engine running, Davison visible behind the wheel. On Sunday afternoon, Fletcher walked slowly past his house, speaking into a radio and making notes. They were trying to catch him in some violation, any violation. An excuse to escalate. Monday morning brought a certified letter. Marcus signed for it and opened the envelope to find a formal notice from the Willowbrook HOA board. The language was dense and bureaucratic, but the message was clear. He had 7 days to comply with the new resident integration protocols or face immediate legal action, including a lien on his property and daily fines of $500. For non-compliance, Marcus photographed the letter and sent it to Agent Chun with a brief message. Add this to the file. Tuesday afternoon, Marcus was working in his home office when he heard voices outside. Multiple voices, some raised. He walked to the front window and felt his stomach drop. Davison and Fletcher were in his driveway again, but this time they weren't alone. 5 or 6 neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk watching. And parked behind the white SUV were 2. Actual police cruisers, lights off but presence unmistakable. 2 uniformed officers from the local police department stood talking with Davison, who was gesturing animatedly toward Marcus's house. This was the escalation Marcus had been expecting. But it still sent a spike of adrenaline through his system. He knew how these situations could spiral. He had investigated too many cases where misunderstandings and bad faith actors combined to create tragedies. He took a breath, centered himself, and walked outside. Davison saw him immediately and pointed. There he is. That's the individual we've been telling you about. The 2 officers turned. One was young, maybe mid-20s, with the nervous energy of someone still learning the job. The other was older, late 40s, with the weathered look of a veteran street cop. His nameplate read, Sergeant D. Morrison. Morrison approached with a neutral expression. Sir, I'm Sergeant Morrison with the county police. We received a call about a potential trespassing situation at this address. Can I see some identification? Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, making sure both officers could see his hands at all times. He had trained countless agents on these exact protocols. Move slowly, stay calm, don't give them any excuse. He handed over his driver's license. Morrison examined it, then looked at the address on the house. Your ID lists a different address. I just moved in last week, Marcus explained, keeping his voice steady despite the audience watching from the sidewalk. I haven't had time to update my license yet. I have the deed and closing documents inside if you need to verify ownership. Davison stepped forward. Sergeant, I've explained the situation. This individual has refused to comply with HOAs. He's been evasive about his identity, refused to participate in mandatory security screenings, and has been generally uncooperative with community leadership. We have reason to believe he may be occupying this property illegally. Marcus felt anger flare in his chest but kept it off his face. That's absolutely false. I purchased this home legally. I have all the documentation. He claims to have. Documentation, Davison interrupted, but he's refused to show it to HOA officials. He's been hostile and threatening towards security personnel. Frankly, Sergeant, his behavior has been suspicious from the start. We've had break-ins in this neighborhood. We have to protect our residents. Mr. Thompson, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. When I saw you that day, when the police had you in handcuffs, I assumed they had a reason. I assumed you must have done something wrong. I didn't question it. And I am ashamed of that. I want you to know that I've thought about it every day since. About what it says about me that I assumed the worst. About what it says about our society that I wasn't even surprised to see a black man being treated that way. I'm sorry. And I'm trying to be better. Marcus shook his hand. I appreciate you saying that, Robert. And I hope you'll remember that. Feeling the next time you see something that doesn't look right. The next time you see someone being treated unjustly. Because the only way we prevent this from happening again is if people like you speak up instead of staying silent. I will, Robert promised. I absolutely will. As Marcus cleaned up after the party, carrying paper plates and plastic cups to the recycling bin, he reflected on how much had changed in a single year. He had moved to Willowbrook looking for peace and found a fight. But in fighting, he had discovered something valuable. He had learned that his work wasn't just about building cases and securing convictions. It was about showing people that justice was possible, that standing up mattered, that one person with courage and knowledge and determination could change an entire system. The house on Willowbrook Lane was truly his now. Not because a deed said so, but because he had fought for it. Because he had refused to be driven away. Because he had used every tool at his disposal to ensure that no one else would suffer what he and 7 other families had endured. And late at night, when the neighborhood was quiet and the stars were visible above the trees, Marcus Thompson would sit on his porch and smile. Because he knew something that Davison and Fletcher and Whitmore had learned too late, you never know who you're really dealing with. That assistant at the grocery store might be studying for her doctorate. That janitor in the courthouse might be a retired judge. That elderly woman on the bus might be a civil rights pioneer who marched with King. And that quiet black man moving into your neighborhood might be the FBI agent who has dedicated his life to stopping people exactly like you. This story reminds us that authority must be earned, not assumed. That uniforms and badges mean nothing without the legitimacy of law and the consent of the governed. That prejudice, even when wrapped in the language of property values and community standards, is still prejudice. And that justice, though sometimes delayed, has a way of finding those who abuse whatever small power they've been given. The next time you see someone being questioned about whether they belong somewhere, the next time you witness harassment, disguised as rule enforcement, the next time you're tempted to assume that the person in handcuffs must have done something wrong. Remember Marcus Thompson's story? Remember that dignity isn't determined by job titles, or property values, or the color of anyone's skin. Remember that real authority comes from respecting others' rights, not violating them. And remember that in our system of laws, everyone deserves the presumption of innocence and the protection of their constitutional rights. Because you never know who you're really dealing with. And even if you did, it shouldn't matter. Everyone deserves justice. Everyone deserves dignity. Everyone deserves to live in peace in the home they've chosen. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've experienced something similar, know that you're not alone. There are people fighting every day to ensure that what happened at Willowbrook never happens again. People like Marcus Thompson, who turn their pain into purpose and their outrage into action. Justice has a way of finding those who deserve it. Sometimes it just needs a little help from those brave enough to stand up and demand it. Others were less sympathetic. The HOA has always been strict about standards, one longtime resident said, defensively. That's why property values stayed high. I'm not saying what they did was right, but people need to understand that we built something special here. Marcus watched the media coverage from his living room with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was being served, yes, but it had taken a federal investigation to expose behavior that should have been obvious. To anyone paying attention, how many neighbors had seen him handcuffed in his driveway and assumed he deserved it? How many had watched families move away and never questioned why? On Friday afternoon, there was a knock at Marcus's door. He opened it to find a woman in her 30s standing on his porch, nervous but determined. "Mr. Thompson?" "My name is Kaisha Williams. My family lived here 3 years ago." "In that house?" She pointed down the street. "We left after 6 months because of what Chief Davison and his partner did to us. I saw the news. I wanted to thank you, to say I'm sorry." "Sorry? For what?" Marcus asked gently. "For not fighting harder. For leaving. For letting them win. If we'd stayed, if we'd pushed back, maybe you wouldn't have had to go through this." Marcus shook his head. "You did what you had to do to protect your family. No one should have to fight for the right to exist peacefully in their own home. This isn't on you. This is on the people who abused their authority and the system that let them get away with it." Kaisha's eyes filled with tears. "Can I do anything? Testify? I want to help. Agent Chun will be reaching out to you. Your testimony is going to be crucial to making sure these men never do this to anyone else." She nodded, wiped her eyes, and smiled. "Thank you. Really. Thank you for not letting them get away with it." Over the following week, 3 more families came forward with similar stories. The case expanded beyond Willowbrook to other neighborhoods where Davison had worked. Before starting his security company, a pattern emerged of a man obsessed with authority he didn't have, using whatever position he could find to exercise power over people he considered beneath him. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but the evidence was so overwhelming that Davison's attorney advised him to take a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Whitmore and providing full documentation of the HOA's involvement, Davison pled guilty to 3 counts of civil rights violations and 1 count of making false statements. He was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and banned from working in any security capacity for life. Fletcher, who cooperated immediately and testified that he had been following Davison's orders without understanding the legal implications, received 18 months and 5 years of probation. Gerald Whitmore fought the charges, claiming he had no knowledge of Davison's methods and had simply been trying to maintain property values. But the emails and meeting minutes told a different story. He was convicted on conspiracy charges and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. The HOA board was dissolved entirely and replaced with court-appointed oversight while the community reorganized. The civil suits came next. All 7 families who had been forced out sued both the HOA and Davison personally. Jennifer Wu represented them brilliantly, and the settlements totaled over $3 million. The HOAS insurance company, faced with clear evidence of intentional discrimination, refused to cover the costs. The money came out of the HOA's reserves, which meant every homeowner in Willowbrook saw their fees increase dramatically to cover the judgment. It was a stark lesson. What you tolerate in your community has consequences. 6 months after the arrests, Marcus stood in his backyard watching the sun set over the trees that lined his property. The neighborhood was quieter now. Some residents had moved away, embarrassed by the association with national news about racism and corruption. Others had stayed and tried to rebuild, organizing community meetings to discuss how to create actual inclusive standards rather than exclusionary ones enforced by prejudice. Marcus had been invited to several of those meetings. He attended when his schedule allowed, offering perspective from both his experience as a target and his expertise as an investigator. Slowly, the community began to change. New families moved in, diverse in background and experience. The security patrol was replaced with a simple neighborhood watch program run by volunteers. His daughter visited that weekend. Driving down from Philadelphia, where she worked as a teacher, she walked through the house, admiring the renovations Marcus had completed, the garden he had started, the home office he had set up. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said, over dinner on the back patio. "What you did here. Standing up to those men, making sure they couldn't hurt anyone else." Marcus smiled. "I was just doing my job. Same work I've been doing for 23 years. "No," she said firmly. "You did more than your job. You could have just moved. Could have avoided the fight. But you stayed and you made it right. That's more than just work. That's character." He thought about her words that night after she had gone to bed in the guest room upstairs. He had spent his entire career fighting injustice at a systemic level, building cases against institutions and organizations. But this time had been different. This time it had been personal. He had felt the weight of prejudice not as an investigator, but as a victim. And it had changed him. He understood now, in a way he hadn't before, why victims sometimes chose not to fight, why they moved away instead of pursuing justice, why they decided that peace was more valuable than vindication. Because fighting was exhausting. Fighting meant reliving trauma. Fighting meant making yourself a target again and again until the system finally acknowledged what should have been obvious from the start. But he also understood why fighting mattered. Because every time someone stood up and refused to be driven away, it made it harder for the next Davison or Whitmore to operate. It created precedent. It put institutions on notice that their tolerance of discrimination had consequences. 3 months later, Marcus was invited to speak at a national conference on civil rights enforcement. He told the story of Willowbrook, carefully avoiding details that might compromise ongoing litigation, but making the broader points clear. He talked about how discrimination in America had evolved, becoming more coded and subtle, hiding behind bureaucracy and procedure. He talked about how private security companies operating with minimal oversight could become vehicles for racial harassment. And he talked about the importance of training law enforcement to recognize when HOA disputes or actually civil rights violations in disguise. The speech was recorded and distributed widely. It became part of training, curricula for police academies. It was cited in policy papers about housing discrimination, and it reached people who had experienced similar harassment and had thought they were alone. Marcus received letters and emails from homeowners across the country describing their own battles with HOAs, security patrols, and neighborhood groups that seemed determined to drive them out. He forwarded each one to the appropriate FBI field office or to attorneys like Jennifer, who specialized in civil rights litigation. Some became cases. Others were resolved with his intervention, simply proving that someone in authority was paying attention. 1 year after moving to Willowbrook Lane, Marcus hosted a block party. It was his daughter's idea, a way to reclaim the neighborhood's identity from the stain of the trial and media coverage. To his surprise, over 30 neighbors attended. They brought food and music and children who ran through yards without regard for property lines. The woman who had apologized to Marcus, Keisha Williams, was there with her family. They had moved back to Willowbrook after the old HOA board was dissolved, buying a house 2 streets over. "We want our kids to see that you don't run from injustice," she told Marcus. "You face it, you change it, and then you live your life in the place you chose on your own terms." That evening, as the party wound down and neighbors headed home, an older white man named Robert Hendricks approached Marcus. He lived directly across the street and had been one of the people watching. When Marcus was handcuffed in his driveway, "Just finished the deep dive. You need to see this. They've done this before, multiple times. We have a pattern. Call me ASAP." Marcus looked up at the white SUV driving away down Willowbrook Lane. He looked at his neighbors retreating to their houses. Their entertainment concluded. He looked at the red marks on his wrists, and he smiled, because the worst mistake Davison and Fletcher had ever made wasn't harassing a black man in his own driveway. It was doing it to the one black man in this entire metropolitan area who had the authority, the resources, and the expertise to make sure they never did it to anyone else again. The phone in Marcus's hand rang. It was Director Hawthorne. "Marcus, I just got a very interesting call from Agent Chun. She says you might have stumbled into something significant. Talk to me." Marcus walked into his house, closing the door behind him on the quiet street, on the watching neighbors, on the life that Davison and Fletcher thought they controlled. "Director," he said, "I need to brief you on a developing civil rights investigation. And I'm going to need a full task force." The next morning, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and 3 phones within reach. Agent Chen had sent over her completed investigation file at 2 a.m., and Marcus had been reading through it since sunrise. What he found was worse than he had imagined. Willowbrook HOA had a pattern. Over the past 4 years, 7 families had moved into the neighborhood and then moved out within 6 months, all of them people of color. Each had faced the same escalating harassment that Marcus was experiencing: fake citations, threats of liens, mandatory security assessments that never seemed to find the homes acceptable, constant surveillance, complaints to actual police. That resulted in unnecessary confrontations. 3 of those families had filed complaints with the county. All 3 complaints had been dismissed as neighbor disputes without investigation. One family had attempted to sue the HOA and had been buried in legal motions until they ran out of money to fight. They had sold their home at a loss just to escape, but it wasn't just the HOA, Davison and Fletcher's company. Willowbrook Security Patrol had a record. 6 formal complaints filed with the State Security Licensing Board, including allegations of false imprisonment, assault, and impersonating police officers. The board had taken no action beyond requiring Davison to take a 4-hour ethics course online. More disturbing were the incident reports Marcus found. Davison and Fletcher routinely wrote up residents for violations that didn't exist or exaggerated minor infractions into major incidents. They had called the police on residents over a dozen times in the past 2 years. And in each case, the residents had been people of color. It was a clear pattern of discrimination. Color of law violations, conspiracy to deprive residents of their civil rights under the pretense of authority. And because Davison and Fletcher wore uniforms and carried badges, they had gotten away with it. Local police treated them as legitimate security personnel. The HOA board either didn't know or didn't care what they were doing in the HOA's name, but Marcus knew. And now he had evidence. He made his first call to Director Hawthorne, briefing her in detail on what he had discovered. She listened without interruption, and when he finished, there was a long pause. Marcus, this is solid. You've got pattern and practice. You've got multiple victims. You've got color of law violations under Title 18, Section 242. This is exactly the kind of case our task force was created to handle. I know, Marcus said, and I want to do this right. I want to interview every family they pushed out. I want to review every incident report, every police call, every HOA board meeting where these tactics were discussed. I want to build this case so thoroughly that when we move, no one can claim it's just a misunderstanding. Agreed. What do you need? 3 agents from my team, full investigative authority, subpoena power. And I need it fast before Davison and Fletcher realize they're being investigated and start destroying evidence. You'll have it by end of business today. Marcus, I'm sorry this happened to you, but I'm glad you're the one who found it. No one builds civil rights cases better than you do. Thank you, Director. His second call was to Agent Chun. Sarah, I need you to contact every family that moved out of Willowbrook in the past 5 years. Set up interviews. I want statements from all of them. Also subpoena the HOAs financial records, meeting minutes, and all communications with Davison's security company, and get me copies of every police report file from this neighborhood in the past 3 years. Already started on the police reports, Chun said. I'll have the families contacted by this afternoon. Boss, this is going to be big when it breaks. No. That's why we're going to make sure it's airtight. The third call was to an attorney Marcus had worked with on previous cases, someone who specialized in civil rights litigation. Jennifer, it's Marcus Thompson. I need your help with something, personal and professional. He explained the situation, and Jennifer Wu listened with the focused attention of someone who had spent 20 years fighting these exact battles in courtrooms across the country. Marcus, you could sue them personally and the HOA for damages, clear-cut Fair Housing Act violations. But if you're building a criminal case, you might want to wait on civil action. Don't want to muddy the waters. That's what I'm thinking. But I want you on standby. When this breaks, other victims are going to come forward. They'll need representation. I'll be ready. Marcus spent the rest of the morning documenting everything that had happened to him. He wrote detailed reports of each encounter with Davison and Fletcher, including exact quotes as best he could remember them. He compiled every letter, citation, and threat that HOA had sent him. He pulled security camera footage from his home system that showed Davison and Fletcher's vehicles parked outside his house at odd hours. By noon. He had a case file that would have made any prosecutor smile. And then, right on schedule, Davison and Fletcher arrived again. Marcus saw the white SUV pull up and felt a strange sense of anticipation. This time would be different. This time, he wasn't the helpless homeowner being harassed by petty tyrants. This time, he was a federal agent gathering evidence for a case that would end careers and change lives. He walked outside to meet them, his phone in his pocket recording everything. Davison stepped out of the vehicle holding a clipboard. Mr. Thompson, I am here to conduct the mandatory security assessment of your property that was outlined in the HOA compliance notice. You can either grant me access voluntarily, or I can return with the HOA board president and a locksmith. Your choice. Marcus looked at him calmly. You have no legal authority to enter my home. I'm denying access. Then you're in direct violation of OA bylaws, Davison said, making a notation on his clipboard. That's an additional fine of $1,000. And I'll be recommending to the board that we immediately place a lien on your property. Fletcher stepped forward. Mr. Thompson, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. If you just cooperate, this would all be over. But you seem determined to cause problems. Makes me wonder what you're hiding in there. I'm not hiding anything, Marcus said. I'm exercising my legal rights as a property owner. You're not law enforcement. You're private security contractors with no authority beyond observing and reporting. You can't issue fines. You can't place liens. You can't enter my home. You definitely can't arrest me. Davison's expression darkened. That's where you're wrong. The HOA bylaws give us broad enforcement authority. We can do whatever is necessary to maintain community standards. And if you continue to obstruct us, I will call the police again. Except this time, I'll make sure they take you away in handcuffs for real. On what charge? Trespassing, for starters. You never completed the new resident integration process, which means your occupancy here was never officially approved. As far as the HOA is concerned, you're illegally occupying this property. It was breathtaking, really. The audacity of it. The complete distortion of reality. Davison had convinced himself that wearing a uniform and carrying a clipboard gave him actual authority. That he could simply say words like trespassing and illegal occupancy and make them true through force of will. Marcus pulled out his phone and held it up, making it obvious he was recording. Say that again, for the record. You're claiming I'm illegally occupying the home I legally purchased and own. The younger officer had his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. His eyes kept flicking between Marcus and the house, as though expecting some kind of threat to emerge. Morrison remained calm, but Marcus could see him recalculating, viewing. Marcus through a different lens now. Suspicious, uncooperative, potentially dangerous. Sir, I'm going to need you to provide proof that you're authorized to be at this address, Morrison said, his tone shifting from neutral to authoritative. Do you have the deed available? It's inside, Marcus said. In my office. I'd be happy to get it. I'll accompany you, Morrison said. It wasn't a request. Marcus nodded and started toward his front door, Morrison following closely. But before they reached the steps, Fletcher spoke up from behind them. Sergeant, I should mention that Mr. Thompson made threats toward me, and Chief Davison, during our last encounter, told us he would make sure we regretted enforcing community standards. We documented everything. Marcus stopped and turned. That's a lie. I never threatened anyone. He said, and I quote, "You have no idea what you're doing," Fletcher said, reading from his notepad. And that we would regret this. That sounds like a threat to me. That's not what I meant. You also said you would be keeping an eye on us, Davison added, his voice carrying to the assembled neighbors. You've been driving past our homes, following us. We've seen your car. Marcus felt the situation sliding out of control, felt the narrative being rewritten in real time. These men were manufacturing a case against him, twisting his words, inventing incidents. And the officers who had arrived with no context beyond Davison's call were absorbing all of it. Morrison's hand moved to his own belt. Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back. The words hit Marcus like cold water. Excuse me? I said turn around. Hands behind your back. Now. Sergeant, I'm not resisting anything. I just told you I'd get my documents, and I'm securing the situation first, Morrison said, his voice hardening. You've been accused of making threats. You're on property that we can't immediately verify belongs to you. Until I sort this out, I need you in cuffs for officer safety. Now, Turn around, or I will take you down. The neighbors on the sidewalk had multiplied. At least a dozen people now stood watching, phones out, recording. Marcus could see the scene. From their perspective, a black man being arrested in broad daylight. Another video for social media, another headline, another hashtag. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't know, was that this wasn't just another case of harassment. This was being done to a federal agent, an assistant special agent in charge. A man who had dedicated his entire adult life to preventing exactly this kind of abuse. Marcus slowly turned around and placed his hands behind his back. He felt the cold metal of handcuffs close around his wrists, felt the bite of the mechanism. Locking into place, Morrison patted him down with practiced efficiency, checking for weapons. He's clear, Morrison said to his partner, who had drawn closer, hand still near his weapon. Davison approached, barely containing his satisfaction. Sergeant, we appreciate you responding so quickly. This individual has been a problem since the moment he appeared in this neighborhood. The residents will sleep better knowing you've taken action. We haven't arrested him, Morrison said carefully. This is a detention while we sort out the property situation. Sir, he addressed Marcus. Where are these documents you mentioned? My office, Marcus said, forcing the words through gritted teeth. Second floor, desk drawer. There's a folder labeled House Documents. Morrison nodded to his partner. Go check it out. The younger officer disappeared into Marcus's house without a warrant, without permission, because Marcus was detained and his rights had apparently evaporated the moment Davison made a phone call. Marcus stood in his driveway, hands cuffed behind. His back, watching his neighbors watch him. Some looked concerned. Most looked vindicated, as though their suspicions about the strange black man who had moved in uninvited had been confirmed. Fletcher was speaking to a small group of onlookers, his voice carrying clearly. We've been monitoring the situation since he arrived. Something just felt off, and we were right. Always trust your instincts about these things. Marcus closed his eyes and breathed. He thought about every victim he had ever interviewed, who had described this exact feeling, the helplessness, the rage, the knowledge that the system designed to protect everyone was being weaponized against you, specifically. He had always understood it intellectually, had built cases around it, had testified about it. But standing in his own driveway in handcuffs while a fake security chief narrated his arrest to a crowd of neighbors, he understood it in a way he never had before. The young officer emerged from the house holding a folder. I found this, Sarge. Looks like closing documents. Deed has his name on it. Marcus Thompson. This address. Morrison took the folder and reviewed it carefully. Marcus watched his expression shift as he read through the documents, saw the realization settling in that maybe this situation wasn't what Davison had described. These look legitimate, Morrison said slowly. He turned to Davison. He does appear to own this property. Davison's confident expression faltered for just a moment before recovering. That doesn't change the fact that he's violated HOA regulations and made threats against security personnel. He still needs to answer for that. OA. Violations aren't criminal matters, Morrison said, his tone cooling slightly. That's a civil issue. But the threats, you said he threatened you. What exactly did he say? Davison glanced at Fletcher, then back at Morrison. He said we would regret enforcing the rules, that he would be watching us, that we had no idea who we were dealing with. Morrison looked at Marcus. Did you say those things? I said they didn't understand the situation, Marcus replied carefully. I never threatened violence. I never followed them. They're the ones who keep showing up at my house. Morrison studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to remove the cuffs. But I need you to understand that we take threats seriously in this community. If there are ongoing issues with the HOA, you need to resolve them through proper legal channels, not through intimidation. I haven't intimidated anyone, Marcus said. They're the ones I'm removing the cuffs, Morrison interrupted. Let's just de-escalate this situation, okay? Marcus nodded, and Morrison unlocked the handcuffs. The metal fell away, and Marcus brought his hands forward, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had left red marks. He wanted to say more. He wanted to file a complaint right there, wanted to explain exactly who these men were and what they were doing. But Morrison and his partner were already walking back toward their cruisers, clearly eager to leave a situation that had become more complicated than they wanted to deal with. Davison watched the officers leave with visible frustration. Then he turned back to Marcus, his expression hardening. This isn't over. You think having a deed makes you untouchable? You think you can just ignore community standards because you have paperwork? We run this neighborhood. The board will still pursue liens, the fines will still accumulate, and we will make your life here so miserable that you'll wish you'd never bought this house. Fletcher nodded in agreement. You don't belong here. Everyone can see it. Why don't you just sell and move somewhere more ... appropriate? The neighbors were still watching, still recording. Marcus looked at their faces and saw the judgment, saw them deciding who he was based on 30 seconds of video and the word of men in uniforms. And in that moment, standing in his driveway with his wrists still aching from handcuffs, with a crowd of strangers deciding his guilt or innocence, Marcus Thompson reached his lowest point. He had spent 2 decades fighting for justice. He had dedicated his career to protecting people from exactly this kind of abuse. And now he was the one being humiliated in public, in front of his own home. But what Davison and Fletcher still didn't know, what none of these neighbors could possibly understand, was that this wasn't just humiliation for Marcus Thompson. The homeowner thought this was something much worse for them. This was evidence. And Marcus Thompson, the FBI agent, had just watched them commit multiple federal crimes while a dozen witnesses recorded everything on their phones as the crowd began to disperse. And Davison climbed back into his SUV with the satisfied expression of someone who had won a battle. Marcus's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from Agent Chun.